Name is Richard Bowerman. I was born and brought up in Newark, New Jersey, 88 years ago. I was interested in the Navy starting when I was 5 years old. My father used to rent places on Long Island Sound in Connecticut, and I got to just love being near the water. I went to public schools in Newark, and a year at Lawrenceville, and then on to Yale, where I graduated in 1939 as the war broke out, and 1942 from law school, although I had been called to duty in August of 1941. I came aboard about 8 o'clock in the evening. I had a couple of cigarettes before I went aboard because I knew I was never going to get off of this ship unless somebody gave me permission. There was every form of umbilical cord from the dock onto the ship. Steam lines, electric lines, water lines, and so forth. It was just a total beehive of activity. While I had been trained at ROTC, other than a couple of summer cruises, this was really my first duty aboard a battleship. And I had no idea what the future was going to bring. Most vivid recollection when I got aboard, the ship had been painted on the inside and out with a paint that was then used by the Navy. But since it had been painted, they discovered paint that was not flammable. So the first job for the crew was chipping every inch of paint inside and outside, or using paint remover and that sort of thing. The place smelled to heaven, and also the sound of chipping of hammers just resonated through the whole ship. The most exciting experience, of course, that I think any of us had up until the time we went to the Pacific in February of '43 was at Casablanca, where we were, the Massachusetts was, with the Wichita and Tuscaloosa, the covering force for the operation. I was at that point the L Division officer. L Division were lookouts. We had stations up in the under the foremast, just below where the air defense officers stood, and on the mainmast astern. The function that Massachusetts and the covering group performed was to contain the ships that were at Casablanca, fire on them if they fired on us, and sink them if necessary. In Casablanca, there were several light cruisers. There was a battleship John Bart, which had 15-inch guns and was moored at the dock. There were submarines and destroyers. The second mission was if the main portion of the French fleet in the Atlantic, which was at Dakar, south of Casablanca, if they should come up and get mixed into it, we were to put them out of action. And the third was to knock out the shore batteries, El Hanke, H-A-N-K-E, and others, and that was our mission. We didn't know whether the French were going to let us come in without an argument or not. Halfway across the Atlantic, it was discovered that nobody aboard the Wainwright, which was Admiral Hewitt's flagship, and on which he was to go into Casablanca to negotiate the terms of the French surrender. Nobody aboard the Wainwright spoke French. So Massachusetts got a message asking if we had any officers that spoke French, and we had two. As it turned out, these two officers were asked to use the Admiral Giffin's stateroom to draft the terms of the surrender. And they were let in right after the Admiral went up from lunch at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And they were still there about 5 when the Admiral came back down. And he said, "What the hell are you doing here now?" And they said, "Well, Admiral, we're having trouble deciding whether to use the subjunctive at this point of the message." Well, old Alkali really showed his true stripe. He threw both of them out of the wardroom with a good demonstration of the irrelevance of the subjunctive. And so every time the Tirpitz blew its stacks, it was observed, and we would go charging out into the middle of the Atlantic, and if we'd ever met it, we were supposed to sink it. Well, I have a great deal of respect for what this ship did, both at Casablanca and the extent to which it trained its crew. But we weren't ready to take on the sister ship of the Bismarck with the accuracy that it had demonstrated. And I doubt that anybody's going to resent my having said that, but it's a fact. We got to the point where we could take them on, but we never had to, because the von Tirpitz, never came out. I was the assistant operations officer and assigned minimal, the low technical stuff. Right over here is a cabinet full of charts. I was assigned to keep those charts up to date. As we roamed about the Pacific, going places where no United States naval vessel ever went before, we were uncovering things that needed to be reported. I remember one all-nav, which designated a certain area as a shoal. Ships could go aground out there. Nobody had ever known it was out there before. Well, one night, the carrier fleet admiral gave us the courses for the night, and they went right through the shoal. I got that to the attention immediately of Admiral Davis, and I think he took rather great delight in sending a message calling attention of the carrier admiral to the fact that his courses took us right through the shoal. We got new courses for the night. The relationships of an admiral to a ship's company were interesting. We, on the staff, had nothing to do with, directly the operations of the flagship. For example, when the fleet was taking the Marshall Islands, the battleship Indiana and Washington collided. Thereafter, they were out of action for months and months. The Washington 9 months and the Indiana for several months. But every time thereafter, it was very common for whoever was in command of the task group to send a message to the Indiana, posit, which means get in position. Well, I remember one night when they got a posit and the captain came down to flag plot here and in effect talked about the fact that they were really relatively in position and asked what I thought should be done about it. I said, I'm not going to tell you anything about how you run your ship. But a more vivid example would be when we were on the Massachusetts. Some captains were more laid back than others. When the ship came back from Bremerton, Captain Warlick had installed on the fantail a skeet machine. It would cast these clay skeets out, and the crew would shoot at them. Well, they were busy doing that one day when up in Flag Plot we were getting the word that there were an air attack forming. The Admiral had the communications part of the staff was over on this side. He had the communications officer send a written dispatch to the USS Massachusetts, go to general quarters. Then he sent me up one deck to tell the captain, Captain Warley, go to general quarters. Well, that was unusual to have to tell, for Admiral to tell a ship, but we didn't get involved in the running of the ship unless we really had to. Davis was just such a wonderful fatherly figure. Davis, when we went into Noumea that morning, said, has either of you read a book called A Generation of Vipers? And neither Joe nor I had. And he said, well, you're ordered to read it. I'll lend you my copy. Well, we found out why. At some point, the author, Roth, was an iconoclast. And one of the things he was blasting was the myth of the superior educations alleged to be available at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Roth made the point, education at Annapolis and West Point was just as good as Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. Well, that's the reason the Admiral made us read the book. Jaffroth was a different personality. He was the senior Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, and probably the biggest. He was 6'3", and when I tried to measure him so that we could make a life jacket for him, I got as far as this, and I said, you have to take it from there, Admiral. He was 63 inches, and the widest part of his beam. And I said, well, we'll get it made up. I had to make it up out of 2 normal life jackets. Well, he said, make it orange. I said, can't be orange. It's supposed to be battleship gray or blue, so you won't be seen. He said, if I have to go overboard, I want to be seen. Make it orange. Flag Plot is a space. We had our own radar detection equipment. We had a massive plotting board. We had communications with all the vital parts of the ship, and close at hand in Flag Plot, we could communicate with any ship under our command, or any other ship for that matter, all of which was done by TBS, talk between ships, which was electronically designed to send messages out straight, not to follow the curve of the Earth, so that they had a very short range. Every once in a while, something bounced off an electronic cloud or something, as a result of which I was, for example, aboard in the Pacific for 27 straight months. Got down to 124 pounds. Again, getting back to Jaffroth, he ordered me down to the sick bay every afternoon to get an eggnog, a little bit laced with things that a good eggnog ought to be laced with. I was supposed to put weight on. The objective of all of this became the occupation of Leyte Gulf, which was on the east side of the Philippines, halfway up and down. At that point, there were 4 carrier task groups under Admiral Halsey. When Halsey was in command of the fleet, it was known as the Third Fleet, and the carrier groups were collectively known as Task Force 38. When Admiral Spruance was in charge of those same ships, it was the Fifth Fleet and was Task Force 58. Spruance, in my opinion, was the finest naval officer afloat that we ever had. He was a sound planner. He had proved his merits at the Battle of Midway when he was in charge of the carriers, because the senior admiral's ship had been disabled and Spruance had to take over and win that Battle of Midway. But he was not in charge of Leyte Gulf. We got there about 8 hours after Kurita had gotten back in. The whole thing was a massive victory for the U.S. forces. But for a battleship crew, it was the last chance. There weren't that many occasions when a surface admiral and his staff were called upon to do things. This was a carrier war, and it was the carrier admirals who by and large led us. But when we went to bombard and when we did things such as bringing these two forces together, that's when things got tense. As I say, I don't think I will ever be as responsible as I felt at that moment in time. Anything I've ever done in life since then pales by comparison to that.